For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, with the latest readout video from our free Wednesday Wake Up email newsletter, to which you should subscribe, an appeal to our viewers also to subscribe to our YouTube or Rumble channel if you haven't already, and some advice to everyone else to keep calm and carry on. And the latter comes because, in the constant flood of bad news from climate alarmists, Dezeen now moans that, quote, our biggest climate challenge is no longer denial, but despair, end quote. And a piece in Nature Mental Health, and yes, there really is such a publication, says, quote, the mental health effects of weather-related disasters are well characterized, yet less is known about the effect of chronic, slow-onset climate change, end quote. Neither of these statements is true. Our biggest climate challenge is actually terrible policy driven by worse science, though a trendy nervous breakdown doesn't help. And the mental health effects of chronic, slow-onset climate change are well understood. There aren't any. If conditions change gradually, and we have time to adapt, it does not cause us to lose our minds, as the NMH piece eventually admits. You alarmists, on the other hand, seem determined to do it, but, we repeat, don't. It doesn't help you, it doesn't help us, and it doesn't help anyone else. So, stay sane, examine the evidence, and relax. Speaking of people who need to unwind and rethink, a remarkable poll for something called the Committee to Unleash Prosperity found that, quote, America's richest citizens want food, gas, and electricity to be rationed in order to fight climate change, a new poll has shown, end quote. Of course, what they really mean is rationed for everyone else, as in all those people who are already rationing these things to make ends meet because their budget doesn't include luxury travel and fancy food. No, really. See, what the poll did is it took a group of 1,000 people who had a postgraduate degree and made at least $150,000 a year, and it turned out that at least half of them had gone to an Ivy League university or a prestigious private one, and it took another 1,000 representative voters. And as Kurt Malberg noted in MercatorNet, quote, the people who run America, or at least think they do, live in a bubble of their own construction, the report's executive summary begins, end quote. It turns out that just 28% of normal Americans want strict rationing of gas, meat, and electricity to fight climate change, but 77% of the elite group did. Only between 13 and 25% of regular folks wanted things like gas stoves, gas cars, air conditioning, SUVs, and so-called non-essential air travel to be banned. But between 53 and 72% of the elite group did, depending which thing you were asking about banning. Now, it's important to recognize here that the public could be wrong and the elite right. But let's at least be clear about one thing. This whole movement is coming down from above by people arguably out of touch with realities like unaffordable energy bills, not up from we the people. In the newsletter, we also quote a viewer's related suggestion of a variant on the old kids game Simon Says, which would be called Science Says, and it's always Science Says, hand over your wallet. And we also note newspapers' warning of record heat and Arctic blasts, the former of course being climate change and the latter just weather, and scratching for scary records, including, quote, a record 4.1 inches, 10.41 centimeters, of rain fell Sunday in downtown Los Angeles, blowing past the previous record of 2.55 inches, 6.48 centimeters, set in 1927, end quote. But, as the Wall Street Journal semi-clarified, it broke the record for that specific date, not for any day of the year or even any day in February. That one was set back in 1913. But still, everybody knows climate change is bringing unprecedented weather, even if it's not. And now, a word from our sponsor, and that's you, our viewers and our readers. Because we're crowdfunded, we're not subsidized by governments, we don't get grants from giant environmental foundations, and we're not getting those oil company checks our critics keep talking about. It's you who sustain our work, so please click here and make a monthly pledge, $5, $10, $20, so that we can keep producing these videos and pushing back against mistaken, even deranged climate orthodoxy. And now, back to me. In the newsletter, we also point out Greta Thunberg's apparent immunity from legal consequences for lawbreaking because, well, her cause is favored by the elite. And we note that the infamous $8 million cost of the solar-powered 9,300 square foot shed on the grounds of Rideau Hall, the official residence of Canada's Governor-General, turns out to have included $500,000 in architect's fees among its 86 separate contracts over 10 years. So yes, it's good to be in the 1%. And, for our part, we also propose a quiz. Who said, quote, climate change is hitting the planet faster than scientists originally thought, end quote, and when? And we note that the Quebec government has decided, thanks to Michael Binion for pointing this out, to forbid cities in Quebec from unilaterally forbidding natural gas hookups. Yes, that's the same government that claims there's no social acceptability for a new fossil fuel pipeline bringing Alberta oil east. In the newsletter, we also note once again the end of snow, or the snow of end. Anchorage, Alaska, in this time of global boiling and vanishing snow, inexplicably looks set to break its all-time snow record. It's even caving in roofs there. And then we bring you a timely warning from Dan McTeague of Canadians for Affordable Energy of a collision course between the net zero obsession of our elites and the reality of energy in Canada, including, as Joe Oliver noted, the extraordinary phenomenon of an emergency alert asking residents of the energy giant province of Alberta to turn everything off that they didn't absolutely need to avoid rolling blackouts due to cold. Not heat, cold. And, of course, bad policy. And then we mock activists who hurled soup at the glass protecting the Mona Lisa in the Louvre in Paris because they asked, quote, what's the most important thing, art or a right to a healthy and sustainable food, end quote. Oh, does art kill crops? Is the Mona Lisa spewing carbon dioxide half a millennium after being painted? Or were you too busy skipping school to protest to learn anything at all? Though, speaking of crops, no sooner are we told to plant microgardens to calm our climate anxiety than a story blares, quote, carbon footprint of homegrown food 5 times greater than those grown conventionally, end quote. Yes, in alarmist world, it's all bad, including the windowsill tomatoes of flaming death. As if the climate were so fragile that you could kill it with the wrong cucumber. Oh, and speaking of not learning things in school, a recent story in the Irish News berated the government and the people for doing too little on climate with the usual blah, 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 blah. Quote, it said that delayed action would likely leave an Irish climate that is increasingly unrecognizable as the century progresses, end quote. Do these people really not understand the global in global warming and think that Irish emissions roast Ireland while, say, Chinese ones only affect the weather in China? Surely they grasp that it's Chinese emissions on a massive scale that are going to affect the world's climate if CO2 really is pollution. We also continue our ECS in the Real World series by noting that for 30 years the IPCC said ECS, which is the absolute amount of warming in degrees that you would expect from doubling the relative proportion of CO2 in the atmosphere, was most likely around 3 plus or minus 1.5. The evidence kept rolling in that ECS values below 2 were quite likely, but just in time for their 6th assessment report, a new paper by Australian climatologist Stephen Sherwood and his colleagues, applying a fancy new method to combine recent climate data with model and paleoclimate data, gave an ECS best estimate of 3.2 and a likely range between 2.3 and 4.7. So the IPCC cheerily said, look, ECS must be above 2.5. But when Nicholas Lewis looked closely, he found that the new study had used some faulty math and outdated data. In a 2022 paper, he fixed the problems, yielding an ECS of about 2.2, perhaps lower. So once again, what happened is that the IPCC jumped on a study that told them what they wanted to hear without checking the math, and once again, they got caught, and once again, they didn't care. Nor are alarmists impressed by global greening that suggests that CO2 helps plants instead of killing them dead. According to a new, and yes, peer-reviewed study by a team led by Jin Cheng of the Nanjing University of Information Science and Technology, rising CO2 levels in the air have not only allowed the world to keep greening, the process is accelerating despite extended droughts that are happening in some areas. A warmer world with more CO2 is supposed to be a crisis, but the world's plants apparently didn't get the memo. Speaking of which, from the CO2science.org archive, we bring you a 2017 paper that looked at, quote, drivers of change in the cover of woody vegetation at the scale of the African continent, end quote. And it turns out that, mercifully, Africa too is getting greener, despite decades of apocalyptic warnings of increased desertification due to some human sin or another. But it turns out that there are some things we're doing wrong, including expanded farming, urbanization, and also desperate poor people scrounging for wood because they don't have more reliable modern energy sources like natural gas. But even so, CO2 is helping more than we're hurting. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and I'm not having a nervous breakdown because the weather is slightly different than when I was a kid.